Greetings. I am Dr. Graciela Canedo Livingston, Provost at Nebraska Wesleyan University. I want to welcome you to this year's presentation of Spooky Evenings. We here at Nebraska Wesleyan are excited and proud of this event that brings together scholars, artists, authors, and filmmakers to discuss the topic of horror in its various manifestations across the arts and the humanities. Professor Juan Jose Castaño Marquez and Dr. Matthew Jarvis have been working tirelessly to bring you the best scholarship in the field of horror through this unparalleled digital humanities event. I would like to acknowledge the generous support from the Nebraska Arts Council, Humanities Nebraska, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment that helps make quality programming like Spooky Evenings possible. Again, welcome and enjoy this presentation of Spooky Evenings.
Tonight on Spooky Evenings, Dr. Brandon Grafius of the Ecumenical Theological Seminary presenting his talk, Constructing the Witch, the Rhetoric of Witch Hunting Through the Ages. Welcome back to Spooky Evenings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my guest, Brandon Grafius, not Grafius, my apologies.
No problem.
I feel like we've been pen pals since May.
We have been. We've had a lot of email exchanges and sent some texts back and forth talking about things and things like that. It's good to spend some time together on Zoom.
Yeah, we're more than disembodied voices or text from the beyond at this point. So your talk tonight, Constructing the Witch, the relation of witch hunting through, the rhetoric of witch hunting through the ages. I turn it over to you, sir.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me on tonight. I'm really just thrilled to be part of this event. Honored to be included with so many incredible scholars and creators. So thanks to Dr. Jarvis and Professor Castaño Marquez for putting this together and for inviting me to take part. I hope you've had the chance to experience some of the other lectures and discussions and that you'll stick around for the rest of the month. So I do have a presentation to try to keep people a little bit engaged here. Let me share this with you. All right, I have a special Halloween background for this presentation. One of the things I love about this conference lecture series of speakers, and really, horror studies in general, is that it's truly a cross-disciplinary environment. I'm one of 2 biblical scholars participating in this year's program, and several other speakers come from other areas of religious studies. I'll aim to honor that spirit of cross-discipline engagement tonight. The main focus of my topic is the figure of the witch. I'm particularly interested in her strange set of historical movements from the, you might say, the anxious corner of the religious imagination, then as a projection in the real world, then as an icon in pop culture, and then in some ways maybe back into the real world. Of course, these movements aren't a straight line, as that brief summary might seem to indicate. It's a back and forth zigzag of a spiral with many movements happening at the same time in different directions. But particularly when we approach the witch from a focus on her rhetorical origins in the realm of religion, I think we can uncover some interesting things about her continued existence in culture and how this history helps us to read her presence in some contemporary horror films. I'm always interested in locating where horror is in the Bible or in religion, because it's found in plenty of places. My first book is called Reading Phineas, Watching Slashers, from my dissertation. And then taking that analysis and moving it into contemporary horror films to show us what those films can teach us about religion, what religion teaches us about those films, and how that those currents move back and forth. The witch has always been a figure entangled with religion. In many ways, our religious traditions created her. It's become a truism in the study of monsters that monsters are not born but created as a cultural construct. We decide what's monstrous based on a comparison with what we considered to be normal. Foucault was one of the early scholars to recognize this in his lectures that are collected under the title of Abnormal, and was followed in time by Noel Carroll and Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, laying the foundation for the contemporary study of monsters. In this understanding, the monster is less biological fact than cultural or rhetorical construction. The witch is a similar construction. Much of the European witch hunting tradition traces its roots back to the Bible, using a single verse to do a whole lot of heavy lifting. At least that's where they found their warrant to do the witch hunting. We do see some of the early prehistory of the witch present in the Bible, mostly through the ways in which community boundaries are put around acceptable and unacceptable practices of magic, and then overlaid with a lens of gender to place a specific focus on female practitioners. Let me take a minute to unpack this idea. I'm focusing on how the ideas of witchcraft and magic are used in the Hebrew Bible, because that's my area of specialization. Lots of scholars have done great work on exploring how these ideas are constructed in distinct but overlapping ways in a variety of cultures. I think it's possible to draw a more or less straight line from how witches were constructed, or at least begun to be thought about in the Hebrew Bible and the culture of ancient Israel, to how they were built in Hellenistic culture, to Roman culture, to early Christianity, to the Middle Ages, and into modernity. Of course, each of these cultures does this in a unique way, based on their own particular set of circumstances and anxieties. But the similarities remain. Deciding what constitutes unacceptable magic to the community, and then attaching these practices to women. Moving through all of these cultures, hitting every stop of the way between the Hebrew Bible and 20th century film is obviously too long of a roadmap to lay out in a lecture of this length, don't worry. I know we've got another lecture tomorrow night, so I've got to be done before then. But various proposals for what this journey looks like are out there if you're interested. I'm going to focus just a bit on the witch and magic in general as rhetorical construction in the Hebrew Bible, then jump ahead to how this construction functions in some modern horror films and what it can tell us about the worldview of those films. We start with the witch, in quotes, of Endor. So as Esther Hamori, one of Spooky Evening's featured speakers later this month, and other scholars have pointed out, perhaps the most famous witch in the Hebrew Bible, frequently known as the Witch of Endor, probably shouldn't be considered a witch at all. The Hebrew that describes her is literally master of the dead, and Hamori prefers a term more like medium. This is the story where King Saul, in despair at losing his throne, wants to talk to the ghost of his deceased court prophet Samuel, and calls up or goes to see a woman who can speak with the dead. There's a long history of biblical interpretation that has added all sorts of salacious and sexualized details to her story, the kind of details that seem to accrue whenever we decide somebody's a witch. But the story itself is really pretty straightforward, and it seems to me that it's presented as a simple act of divination. While the story includes a note about Saul having cut off the mediums and wizards from the land, he kicked out all the people practicing magic. The forms of these nouns are masculine, which would be appropriate as well for a mixed gendered group. Saul does ask specifically for a woman who is a medium, but for the most part, the gender of this medium doesn't seem important in the story. She's not treated in any kind of stereotypical fashion. Really, there aren't many details about her at all. The focus is much more on the ghost she calls up than it is on her. Here, we're looking at this as a 19th century engraving of her by John Kay after a 17th century painting by Adam Elsheimer. There is one clear place in the Hebrew Bible where the practice of illicit magic and gender collide. At least this is the clearest. In the set of laws known as the Covenant Code, usually thought of as the earliest laws in the Bible, Exodus 22:18 in the English translation, 22:17 in the Hebrew, famously says, as translated by King James, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Other translations, like that's the NRSV next to it there, says a female sorcerer, which is probably closer to the mark. It's the Hebrew word mekashifah, which just means someone who practices magic with a feminine ending on it. However, it's not completely disconnected from the idea of a witch. This law code specifies what they're worried about is a female magic user, and there's nothing equivalent for a male. And then it moves on to a different law without really explaining or anything like that. So we have this strange little piece here that doesn't really give us context other than in a list of prohibitions. The case of there's another similar kind of law in Deuteronomy that often gets translated with witch language, but it's a little different. Deuteronomy 18 uses a similar word when it talks about the kind of magicians who cannot be a part of the Israelite community. But in Deuteronomy, it doesn't even have a feminine ending. So even though the King James Version translates the list in Deuteronomy 18 as anyone that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch. That's quite a list of forbidden magic practices. More modern translations are again on firmer ground when they translate this word as sorcerer. It just means someone who uses magic. This law from Deuteronomy isn't concerned with female magic users in the same way that the Exodus text is. But both laws still show a concern with people who use magic, and this is going to be an important part of the rhetorical construction of the witch throughout the centuries. It begs an interesting and important question. What does the Bible here mean by magic? It's not that we never see instances of acceptable magic in the Bible. Moses uses his staff to part the Red Sea. You might see Charlton Heston with his big white beard doing that. And later on, Moses hits his staff against a stone in the desert to make water flow out of it. When we get to the New Testament, Jesus is using magic all the time. The distinction is who authorizes the magic. If it's Yahweh or the New Testament God, then it's all right. If it's some other divine being, then it's to be condemned. Older generations of scholars frequently accepted this distinction uncritically, making a clear division between miracle and magic. But I think that distinction doesn't really sustain itself. We see this distinction play out most clearly in a short passage from Exodus, one that's too weird to make its way into Sunday school classes or film versions very often. God has worked out a plan with Moses. Moses and his brother Aaron are to go to Pharaoh and demand the release of the enslaved Israelites. God knows that Pharaoh is going to refuse. Disturbingly, it seems like God even encourages Pharaoh's refusal so that God gets to flex God's muscles. Then God prepares Moses and Aaron for a demonstration of miracles. The 7 plagues are what's most well known, but right before those start, there's a strange episode with Aaron's staff. God tells Moses that Pharaoh isn't going to listen to him. So, God says, when this happens, Moses should have Aaron throw down his staff and watch as it turns into a snake to demonstrate Aaron's power, and through Aaron, Moses. The brothers come before Pharaoh. And the scene plays out just as God said it would. The staff miraculously, magically, transforms into a snake. Not wanting to be outdone by God, Pharaoh has his magicians match this trick by having their own staffs transform into snakes. It's about the most obviously phallic male dominance game you can imagine, although I do love this painting where it looks like they're throwing dice or something like that. But what's interesting to me is how the Bible describes what the Pharaoh's magicians do. These magicians, called in Hebrew the mikshafim, just a masculine plural form of the word for female magic user we looked at above, are said to transform their staffs by their secret arts, or maybe by their own incantations, elahatayim. As opposed to using the power of God, which the text assumes is legitimate, their power comes from this other place, their own arts. It comes from themselves, not from God, and there's something sinister about it. So even though they do the same thing, transform their snakes into staffs, it's viewed in an entirely different light. Their staffs into snakes, yeah. In the world of the Bible, it's the difference between a miracle and magic. The episode ends with Aaron's snake eating the other snakes. God's snake is apparently bigger and meaner than those of Pharaoh's magicians. Many scholars of religion have tried to make a clear distinction between magic and religion, but the distinction proves really difficult to maintain. James Frazer famously argued for an evolutionary viewpoint. Magic was the first rung of the ladder, followed by religion and then science. In Frazer's estimation, there were a few markers that distinguished magic from religion, but the main one is that religion understood the deity as being supreme, whereas magic believed that humans could harness divine forces through the right incantations and rituals. While pointing out an interesting distinction, this definition didn't seem adequate, so scholars tried to add things, noting that in many ancient texts, there's a distinction between a deity and a demonic force, or something that is done in public for the benefit of the society or the group as a whole, versus something that's done in private for the benefit of the individual. So making water burst forth from a rock in the desert to provide water for your community is a religious miracle, while applying someone with a love potion is magic. In the last several decades, scholars have noted that these descriptions of magic and miracles in ancient texts, like the one I just discussed from Exodus, aren't exactly innocent. They're clearly putting their thumb on the scale in one direction or the other. For me, the real tell in the Exodus passage above is the description, as I mentioned before, this word by their secret arts, secret, not public, their own power, not something divine. This all leads to the conclusion that these categories, magic, miracle, are rhetorical constructs, not neutral descriptions. While the rhetorical purpose is slightly different in each case, frequently charges of magic are levied against an individual or group as a way to discredit them, as a way to assert authority over them, or as a way to mark them as outside of the community. The biblical text is pretty consistent with this. Magic is denigrated. If a practice is approved, it's attributed to the power of God and described in different terminology. It might be exactly the same kind of ritual, interpreting dreams, for example. But if it comes from God, it's a good thing. If it comes from another divine or demonic power, it's either denigrated as ineffectual or condemned as evil. A pair of interesting test cases for this are two places, one in the New Testament and one in the Hebrew Bible, where magicians are given at least qualified praise. While these episodes might first lead one to believe that magic is acceptable under certain prescribed conditions, they actually serve to emphasize the rhetorical point that God is above all magic. First, the New Testament example is straightforward. The three magi in the Gospel of Matthew. I think that's a pretty accurate representation of them, right? Note that we often refer to them as the three wise men, so that we don't have magicians messing up our Christmas story. The biblical text is pretty clear to refer to them as magi. Kimberly Stratton mentions the three magi as one counterexample of magicians who are associated with positive wisdom rather than with evil, non-authorized practices. But I read it slightly differently. They start under the employ of King Herod and are sent on a mission to find the newborn Messiah and report back. At this point, they're the stereotype of the evil magician who is in the service of the bad king. They're on the other side. At this point, they're identified as magicians, not miracle workers. When they arrive at the stable in Bethlehem, they recognize the power and majesty of this newborn and instead pay homage to him, then return home without telling the king of the child's whereabouts. So we have a trio of magicians who, when confronted with a true religious miracle, announce their subservience to it. It seems to me that this is another tale of miracles and magic with a sly point to make. God rules over even the magicians. In that way, it's the same kind of a statement as the contest between Aaron's staff and the court magicians of Pharaoh. We also have Balaam the prophet, who is often referred to as a magician as well, because he seems to have control over curses and blessings. This is a story from the Hebrew Bible. You'll find it in Numbers 22 through 24. The painting here is from Gustav Jaeger in 1836. He gets hired by the Moabites, one of Israelites' enemy nations, to put a curse on the people of Israel. The assumption seems to be that this curse will be efficacious. So the text is establishing that magic is real, but evil. He considers this, then hears from God that he should bless Israel instead of cursing them, and that this blessing will have the backing of Yahweh. So here's God's angel showing up in front of Balaam after Balaam's donkey tried to warn him. Balaam's donkey is one of two examples of talking animals in the Bible, along with the snake in the Garden of Eden, for whatever that piece of trivia is worth. So Balaam decides to pay heed and bless Israel to the fury of the king who hired him. Unfortunately, this isn't enough to keep Balaam from being killed by the Israelite army a few chapters later. He still remains an ambiguous figure. But again, the magician learns that his powers are beneath those of God. He withdraws from his mission to curse Israel and follows the command of God to bless them instead. So here's a summation of what we've learned so far about the rhetoric of magic versus miracles, or you might even say the distinction is magic and religion. Miracles and religion are good, magic is bad. And of course, I mean this as the way they are constructed by the texts. So to sum up, the Hebrew Bible views magic as being something that comes from a source other than God. If it comes from God, even the same act is viewed positively and frequently described with different terms. In some instances, the Hebrew Bible seems to place a particular focus on female practitioners of non-sanctioned magic, like the passage from Exodus, but not always and not usually. And even some of the characters who are later kind of associated with witchcraft, like I think Jezebel has a lot of those associations, doesn't really have much to do with magic in the actual stories. What we learn from this really admittedly brief survey is that magic is a rhetorical category rather than a thing in and of itself. And the same is true of the category of the witch, at least at first. She's a rhetorical construct created by anxious theologians, then projected into the world and given flesh. So when the Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous witch hunting guidebook of the 15th century, builds its foundation on Exodus 22:17, 22:18 in the English translation, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," it's not really engaging in sophisticated biblical exegesis. That's not the point. It's taking a few passages from the authoritative tradition it's inherited, then using that to buttress its worldview. A lot has been written about how the anxieties concerning gender and Enlightenment beliefs led to the fixation in early modern Europe with witch hunting, and how this was exported to the colonies. I find Walter Stevens' argument fascinating that this is indicative of a crisis of faith brought about by Enlightenment principles. If God's existence is suddenly in doubt, one way to prove the existence of God is to find concrete evidence of the work of the devil. But the same basic principle that we've been exploring is at work. We draw a sharp distinction between practices we find acceptable and those we don't. And then we take our anxieties from the arena of sexuality and throw them all together in a pot. We stir for a bit and we come up with the idea of the witch. It's obvious that witch hunting, and really the entire discourse of witchcraft that enabled it, is one of the darkest chapters of the Christian Church's history. It took these rhetorical constructions based on fear, based on misunderstandings, based on a desire for power, and actualized them in the bodies of vulnerable people. Here in the United States, we often think of the Salem witch trials of 1692 as being the primary culprit, but there was a long history of witch hunting both in Europe and the colonies before this. And what was being attacked was a social and rhetorical construct, since in reality, pacts with the devil that can give human magical powers don't exist. The church chased after a fantasy and caught real life, flesh and blood people. Now I'd like to jump ahead a bit and explore some of the ways in which these movements happen in contemporary film. This discourse often plays out in fascinating ways in the diegetic world of horror films. In some cases, the films need to do some explaining and projecting backwards into history to make this witchcraft fantasy turn into reality, so that it can then move forward into the present world of the film. Frequently, this happens within a film that already has some, what I would say, problems with patriarchal worldviews, or at least are embedded within that kind of a worldview. The 2020 Spanish film Voces, given the English title of Don't Listen, which I can only surmise is an attempt to capitalize on the success of the prior year's Don't Breathe, features a house that's haunted. The reason becomes clear when the family uncovers a hidden room in their basement that served as a torture chamber for the Inquisition. The ghost that's haunting them is the ghost of a witch who was tortured. Father Herman, playing the role of flesh and blood plot explainer, informs the family that the Inquisition was a shameful part of the church's past, resulting in the deaths of uncounted innocent individuals. But every now and then, a real witch got caught up in the machinations, and that's what we're dealing with here. So we have a nod to the actual history of witch hunting, which involved the torture and killing of innocent people, as kind of an apology, but then an exception that allows for the plot to move forward. Another pair of recent films doesn't try to split the difference in this same way, just stomps unknowingly or perhaps knowingly over all this history. It might be just a way to reinforce the film's worldviews. My image is gone here. Well, this was supposed to be an image for The Unholy. This year's The Unholy wasn't a great film by any means, although when it's 99 cents for rent on iTunes, it's definitely worth that. And it's an interesting one from the perspective of my research. Its tagline is even perfect: be careful who you pray to. I love it. It's hard to imagine a film that checks off more of the boxes in the horror and religion intersection. At times, it feels like they were reading academic theory from Doug Cowan, Timothy Beale, or myself, and then wrote the script as a way to support all of these theories. But in any case, the film centers on a disgraced journalist on the outside of his profession because he apparently made up a series of stories years ago when he was flying high as a star reporter. He stumbles on the story that he hopes might get him back to the top in a rural Catholic congregation that's fallen under the sway of a young woman who appears to be a modern-day prophetess, channeling Mary to offer guidance and miraculous healings. There's that word, miraculous, and it's again a contested one in this film. But in a twist that surprises no one, Mary is actually a witch who was killed by an angry mob on the church's property in the mid-1800s, and the modern-day prophetess is her last living descendant. So we have an actual witch projected back into history to provide the backstory for the present-day goings-on of the film. While the film is fascinating from a religion and horror perspective, it seems to have missed all of the academic discussion on gender in the horror film that's taken place since Clover, Creed, and others. This film is another example of Her Body Himself, in which the body of a young woman becomes the battleground for a middle-aged man's story of redemption. And we know that's not unique to horror films, but horror is often a prime culprit. Even though the body of Alice, the young prophetess, is the site of the struggle between good and evil, the story is really about whether disgraced reporter Jerry will rediscover his integrity and be rewarded for his hero's journey. While this is an all too common discounting of female characters that permeates Hollywood, I still wonder if it's not an accident that a film with this type of worldview accepts, even if just for its backstory, the historic reality of witches. A less ambiguous case is James Wan's 2013 film, The Conjuring. Here's the famous scene that was, or shot that was used in the movie poster with the house in the background and the noose that represents where the witch was hung several hundred years ago. The Conjuring universe is generally thought of as having a clearly evangelical worldview. There have been some great articles on that recently, and one in which the church has things basically right, even if the institution itself is ineffectual and gets some gentle fun poked at it. The first Conjuring has a joke about the Warrens getting a call from the Vatican telling them their exorcism has been approved after they already went ahead and performed it. The exorcist who's able to help out the family in the curse of La Llorona is an ex-priest who left the church because of all the bureaucracy. And The Conjuring 3 features not one, but 3 priests who range from completely passive to unintentionally aiding the cause of evil. But Ed and Lorraine understand the evil that the church is fighting against and recognize that the ancient exorcism rites are the most powerful tool we have. So whereas the contemporary church might be mired in bureaucracy and has kind of lost its way, it's built on the right foundation. And the films prove them right time and time again. So the implication seems to be that the church may have lost some of its power over the years, but that power is still there if we can dig it up and find it again. It's a world in which good and evil are in constant struggle with each other, and in which the main thing keeping most of us safe from the forces of darkness is the church, even if it sometimes strays from that mission. But for the Conjuring universe, there's one more important force that protects us: the traditionally structured patriarchal family. This focus shines through in The Conjuring 2 when Ed and Lorraine are helping a single British mom get rid of the demonic presence in her house. In addition to performing the rituals, Ed takes some time out to pick up an old guitar and do a ham-handed Elvis impersonation, gathering everybody together for family time. Ed and Lorraine's picture book romance is repeatedly depicted as one of the factors that allows them to stand firm in the face of evil. Rather than giving us a final jump scare, the film Conjuring 2 even ends with Ed and Lorraine dancing to the previously performed Elvis song. And in the third installment, this focus on heterosexual love has been sharpened. Near the film's climactic confrontation, Lorraine gives the groan-inducing observation, "She thought she could use our love against us, but our love is what makes us strong." In the first Conjuring, Ed has a second job in addition to that of exorcism. He's got to show Mr. Perrin what it means to be the man of the house. As a long-haul truck driver, Roger is frequently away for days at a time. It's during these absences that the spirits of the house are able to attack his wife and daughters. The critique of Roger in the film isn't subtle. His absence allows evil to run rampant through the house. And because he's away, he's unable to fulfill the role of masculine protector. So as Ed and Lorraine move in to help the family, Ed fixes the family truck, helps out with the plumbing in the kitchen, and they make a pancake breakfast for everybody. The implication is pretty obvious. Ed and Lorraine can get the demons out, but Roger has to step up to be the man of the house so that evil won't come back again. When we combine this patriarchal worldview with The Conjuring's backstory, we can see the ideology of witch hunting shine through strongly. The spirit that's haunting the Perrin family is of a woman named Bathsheba Sherman, who is described as having been a descendant of Mary Town Estey, who was hung during the Salem witch trials. Apparently, Bathsheba inherited this evil from her ancestor, and then sacrificed her child to Satan. Bathsheba Sherman died in 1885 and was buried in the town cemetery. There wasn't a hint that any of the deeds attributed to her in The Conjuring have any basis in reality. Both Bathsheba and Mary Estey are historical figures. Mary was, in fact, executed during the Salem witch trials. So we've got an interesting relationship with history here. While the Salem witch trials are now universally thought of as a case of mass hysteria or ascribed to some other combination of sociological factors, The Conjuring takes a real-life woman from these trials, and rather than presenting her as a persecuted innocent, runs with the idea that she was, in fact, a real-life witch. Then imparts this evil onto another historical woman who, by all accounts, lived a perfectly normal life. But in the world of The Conjuring, both of them are transformed into sources of evil. If you view the world through the dualistic lens of good and evil, there has to be evil for you to struggle against. And if you view the world through the idea that the patriarchal family structure is the good and proper order, you've got to have a witch that the family can rise up against. The Conjuring makes this dichotomy clear. The family protects children, the witch kills them. Now, of course, there are many more ways to explore the discourses of witchcraft, and many films and TV series have been working to turn the discourse inside out. I'm sure that Dr. Heather Green will be talking about some of these when she looks at witchcraft on the small screen later this month. I'll be sticking with film since it's what I know best. While there have been a number of narratives that have reclaimed the image of the witch as a source of empowerment, there's also the possibility of diving deeply into the manner in which the discourse of witchcraft has been constructed by Christianity, by patriarchy, by all sorts of societal forces, and attempting to uncover this, reveal this from the inside. I feel like this is the trick attempted by writer-director Robert Eggers in his film, The Witch. I'm imagining most of you have seen this by now. If not, apologies in advance, but since it came out in 2015, I feel like the period where I should be careful of spoilers has expired. What is the statute of limitations on spoilers? Do we have a clear answer?
We spoil everything here.
We do. It's pretty tough to talk about movies in any kind of depth without some spoilers, and I think this one in particular. You have to take into account the entire arc of particularly Thomason, and that involves major spoilers. So yeah, sorry. If you have to pause this and then run and go watch it and then come back, I'll still be here in an hour and a half. I mean, I'll be here on YouTube. While some viewers have proposed that all of the supernatural elements of the film, the witch and Satan in particular, are dreams of one or more of the family members, I find it more plausible that we are supposed to interpret these as real events. The director Eggers remarked at one point that he conceived of this as kind of a Puritan's nightmare. And it has that function, but I don't think that means we're not supposed to view the events as real. I think the devil is clearly a real physical presence in the film. And from very early on in the film, we as viewers know that there is definitely a real live witch living in the woods. So it seems at first like we're in the realm of the conjuring or the unholy, where we take the witch-crazed pilgrims at their word and assume that somehow history proves that witches were real. But the witch takes a detour from this blueprint. Instead, it's going to pull back and show how a witch gets constructed, first rhetorically, and then how this rhetoric becomes real. I'll try to go over the background as quickly as I can. Hopefully most of you have seen the film, or you can follow along reasonably well if you haven't. And if you haven't, you'll be encouraged to see it right away, since I really think it's one of the probably 4 or 5 best horror movies of the decade. That seems like a safe enough hedge. It starts with a family who is excommunicated from their pilgrim colony due to some heretical beliefs on the part of their father. It's not exactly clear in that opening trial scene, but I suggest in my Devil's Advocates monograph that he was likely some sort of antinomian, meaning that he was one of the Puritans who didn't believe the church had the authority to intervene between the direct connection that a believer has with God. His main problem is that he is refusing to submit to the authority of the colony. But in any case, we can see from the very beginning that the family is not necessarily on board with William's obstinate refusal to repent. As William announces he won't relent, even if the consequence is banishment, Thomason glances quickly over at her mother before regaining her composure. It's the first time we've seen any of the family members make any movement. They've just been staring straight ahead before then. And once the family is dismissed, she lingers for a bit in shock. Here's the look on her face afterwards, which I think is just an amazing moment of underplaying while still clearly conveying what's going on inside Thomason's head. So the family is sent off into the wilderness on account of their father's unshakable religious beliefs. As we learn through the film, these beliefs are a strict interpretation of Calvinism, very similar to what we have preserved in many of the Pilgrim's writings from this time. If you know much about the movie, you know Eggers really, really did his research. It's funny, while William the Patriarch is being branded as a heretic, his conversations with his family seem like nothing but Orthodox Puritan beliefs. One of the more brilliant features of the film is how we can see each of the characters respond to these harsh and unforgiving beliefs of their patriarch. But for the purposes of this talk, we should focus on Thomasin. She is, after all, the titular witch, or at least she becomes this. Along with a brief montage of the family traveling and establishing their new homestead, one of the first scenes we see is Thomasin at prayer, offering a private confession to God. She has lots of sins to confess, at least she thinks she does. I've been idle of my work, she laments, disobedient of my parents, neglectful of my prayer. I have in secret played upon thy Sabbath and broken every one of thy commandments and thoughts. So it sounds like she has sometimes taken a little bit of time off from work, hasn't prayed as much as she feels like she thought she should, and sometime had some negative thoughts. I feel like if that's all I had to confess, I would be doing pretty well. These seem like the sins of someone who is trying as hard as they possibly can to be a good daughter. At least for myself, I'm thankful I don't feel the need to confess every time I've been idle at my work. But just in these first few minutes, we clearly understand that Thomasin is struggling with the expectations placed on her. The religion seems like it's not hers, it's her father's. And she tries as hard as she can to live up to it, but lives with the worry that she won't be able to. The family starts to fall apart barely 10 minutes into the film when baby Samuel goes missing. Thomasin had taken him down to the river. This is from the game of hide and seek, or from peekaboo, excuse me. So when he disappears, all suspicion falls to her. We first start to see the serious cracks in Thomasin's facade during that fascinating scene when Mercy, one of the creepy twins, pretending to be the Witch of the Woods. Thomasin scolds her, then takes on the persona of the witch herself, putting the fear of the devil into Mercy. It's a performance that goes on a little longer than we'd expect and is a little too convincing. Thomasin initially falls under suspicion because she fits the tropes of a witch, a young woman whose sexuality poses a threat to the patriarchal family unit. Thomasin herself doesn't express much in the way of sexual desire through most of the film, but the way her brother Caleb lets his gaze linger over her bosom certainly demonstrates that for this Puritan family, her budding sexuality is a crisis. So after these initial suspicions take root, the film demonstrates the way in which the witch is constructed. While Thomasin is most clearly not a witch at the film's beginning, by the end she has been turned into one, in large because of her family's accusations. They come to a head after Caleb meets the actual witch in the woods and stumbles back to the family homestead near death. The family completely disintegrates in a series of accusations, leading to the climax where Thomasin assumes the mantle of the witch. In my reading, the film dramatizes the historical process of creating witches. We start with patriarchal anxiety, find a young woman, old woman, whoever isn't fitting into the community right. We find someone to toss these anxieties onto, and the next thing we know, she's a witch. This is precisely the process that Thomasin undergoes in this film. She's not a witch when the film begins. You can see she's not completely on board with her father's agenda, but we also see through her prayers and her work to support the family, she's doing everything she can to exist within those strictly defined parameters. But it's not enough. The expectations placed on her are impossible. So she ends up falling short and ends up being built into a witch. As is often the case with horror films, in The Witch, the rhetorical process becomes literalized. As I conclude, let me share a different picture here with you. have a discount code for conference participants from publisher, auteur, and Liverpool University Press here. So we've seen how the category of witch is a constructed category, one that's built out of anxieties and rhetoric rather than something that has a prior existence in the real world. I've focused on this rhetorical process in the Hebrew Bible, but we can see it in many different cultures, each with their own particularities as to how this act is accomplished. And then we've seen how a selection of modern horror films use a similar process, either to use the anxious category of the witch as a way to reinforce the film's patriarchal worldview, or as a way to dramatize the creation of the witch in a critical, reflective manner. The figure of the witch is used in films like The Conjuring and The Unholy to support a patriarchal worldview, while films like Don't Listen try to make use of the witch as a monster, but sidestep this question. And then we have films like The Witch, where this category is examined and critiqued. When horror can do the work of taking these sometimes hidden societal processes and demonstrating how they function, they can explore something truly frightening indeed. Thank you.
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting myself there for a second. I'm trying to think where to begin because I have my notes are like a spaghetti diagram right now. So if I'm understanding, then the definition you're giving of a witch is gendered female user of non-Judeo-Christian given magic.
I think within our cultural construct, I think that would be true. And I'm aware that historically, in the Salem witch trials, there were some men who were caught up in the net, but I think that's definitely the exception.
Sure. No, I just want to make sure I have that situated before I dive in and engage, sure. Because I don't want to go from a shaky foundation.
Sounds good.
So I guess my first question is then, where does early on this relationship to access to magic come from, if not from God?
So early on, in the Hebrew Bible, the idea would be it would be other gods. It would come from a god like a god like Baal or something like that. That it comes from a god who isn't recognized as an official god. So it's thought of as other from that perspective.
So what are those beings then? How do they fit into the cosmology of it all?
We see, since the Hebrew Bible is written over a period of over 1,000 years, we see the cosmology change. Okay. But I think in the earliest texts, you have this idea where it almost like every region has its own localized god, and Yahweh is one god among many gods. Gradually, we begin to think Yahweh is the highest God, and these other divine beings are beneath God. We have some texts in the Hebrew Bible, Psalm 82 or the book of Job are probably the clearest examples, where there really is a divine council, where God is seen talking with the other gods. Okay. And then we gradually move to more of a monotheistic point of view, where Yahweh is the only God, and these other gods they don't really exist. People who worship them are deluding themselves.
So what's the transition point then from the Hebrew text to the Christian text with these beings? Do these beings then represent demons, or?
That's where we would start to get then the idea of demonic forces that are somehow divine powers, but that are in opposition to God.
Okay.
And in the New Testament, we don't have a really clearly defined system of this. It doesn't become systematized until a few hundred years later. So we don't have all the legions of angels and things like that clearly mapped out. But we have the beginning sense of this kind of cosmology.
Okay. So is this where does the transition come into, I guess, pop cultural belief historically that it's a pact with presumably Lucifer? The guys, this gets always muddy because Lucifer is one being, Mephistopheles is one being, Baal is one being. where does it transition into? It is a pact with Lucifer that gets one magical powers that are not derived from Yahweh or God.
I'm trying to think of what the earliest texts I can think of that would specifically demonstrate that would be. You have hints of it already in the New Testament where Jesus wanders out into the desert and is tempted by the devil, and the devil, tells him, "Well, I'll give you power if you'll just worship me, or if you'll just, can you make these stones turn into bread if you're hungry and feed yourself?" And so this is the kind of I think like a proto example of that, signing the devil's book.
The Scorsese version of that is quite good. The Last Temptation of Christ,
yeah,
quite good with the different. It's a lion, a snake, a flame, and a woman.
Yes.
No, that's definitely one of my favorite film scenes. That's interesting to think of too, as that moment, as this first almost crossroads deal.
Crossroads deal. I like it. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
no, it really is. This is Jesus's early Robert Johnson moment, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm trying to decide which winding path to go.
Sure. Down. It was kind of a winding presentation, so it's kind of
no. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I'm just I don't want to get too far ahead of myself either. I've always taken the idea of witchcraft to be, I've always gendered it female as well in terms of how it's been treated historically. And I've always taken it to be the obtainment of forbidden knowledge.
And I think there's a really close discourse between magic and forbidden knowledge. I think those two things are tied together, that forbidden knowledge is almost a kind of magic. Like we see, I think I gave the example briefly, as one of the places where you see that kind of magic discourse in the Hebrew Bible is with the interpretation of dreams. Mm-hmm. That when somebody like Joseph interprets dreams that comes from God, that's a sign of his God's power.
Well, because where I try to situate it, and I think particularly when you get into the 19th century and you get these different readings of the Bible, because you get a much more pro-Lucifer group of people around just in general, thanks to Milton, in spite of himself. You get, I see sort of like Eve, then Eve as Lilith becoming this first proto-witch figure.
Yeah. I think we can certainly see that, because that the idea of Eve as introducing original sin and things like that really comes about at the same time that we're really looking at discourses of not only heresy, but figuring out how to connect that to ideas of witchcraft in kind of the early era, immediately after the time of Jesus, when the earliest church theologians are starting to figure out how to systematize all this stuff. Because I was just going to mention, in the Hebrew Bible itself, Eve is really not this temptress or this witch figure. Whenever in a biblical interpretation class, I'll often have my students read Genesis 3, where that story happens, and ask where Adam was when Eve is talking to the serpent and gets the apple. And you notice in a little aside in the Bible that she takes the apple from the serpent and then hands it to Adam, who was standing next to her. That implication seems to be that he has been passively standing there this whole time, just ineffectually watching.
I mean, that has a lot of different implications too. I mean, I think too, like how treatments of Noah change. Right?
Yeah.
No, I wonder at it though, because you think of the legacy that comes out of Eden in terms of Cain and Abel and the creation of murder, but also just the idea of historically witches in relationship to the destruction of the child, which I'll get to in a moment. But also, like, you speed it up, you get into the 1930s, right? And I think to like Snow White and the witch with an apple.
Yeah.
And of course, it's both things are positioned around burgeoning sexuality, which is something you put in context of the Eggers film as well.
Oh, and there's certainly an apple plays a key role in the Eggers film. With,
right.
After Caleb meets the witch in the woods, as he comes back near death, he vomits up the apple, an apple core.
So I have to wonder if that's partially where that longevity of imagery comes. Obviously, there's, like the hat comes from the Spanish Inquisition. The cauldrons come from the fact that women who were brewers got accused of witchcraft because the men wanted to take over their trade. There's a lot of different places where our iconography comes from.
Yeah.
But I have to wonder if that central gesture is that early.
That it makes a lot of sense. It always seems to me like even if it's not a straight line, you can always see the seeds being planted, and
pun intended there.
Only afterwards.
Speaking of puns,
beforehand, I might have stayed away from it because it was a bad pun. But
well, speaking of puns, when you're talking like the "Thou shalt not suffer a witch" coming from the covenant, I was like, is this partially where the word coven is going to be coming from too?
So that's one of the earliest legal codes in the Hebrew Bible that's referred to as the Covenant Code, and it's got a list of prohibitions, and scholars have done all sorts of work to try to figure out how they're connected together and like what kind of organizational logic there is, because it seems like it's just kind of random.
This is the mitzvah? Is that what that is?
I'm sorry, what was that?
This is the mitzvah? Is that what this is?
Yeah.
Okay. It's in here somewhere. Okay, so I want to go to ancient Greece from here.
Oh, which I know less about, but
okay.
I'll see if I can.
Well, because probably the most famous witch in Greek mythology is Circe, who changes the men into swine with Odysseus. But Circe, of course, has a sister, which is Medea.
Yeah.
And Medea performs an act of witchcraft at the end of the play Medea, right? She does it through the sacrifice of children. So I want to hang up on this for a second because it also happens in The Witch. And the same sort of result happens, right? Which is she casts one of the earliest and most gruesome spells ever, which is where we find you need to sacrifice a baby to fly.
Yeah.
And that seems to hold true through the ages. A lot of Spanish Inquisition representation involves witches taking babies to fly.
Yeah, I think you're right that has endured. Do I remember reading that earlier iterations of the Medea legend had some different takes on her and didn't necessarily treat her as a witch in the same way the Euripides play, right?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
it's not even. It's more that she casts one spell, right? It's not even that she's a practitioner in general. It's a good spell. She summons down the chariot of Apollo to fly the sun across the sky in revenge. If you're going to cast a spell, go big or go home. But I first came across this concept actually from I think it's Troma that produced Warlock in the 80s. Are you familiar with these?
Is that remind me of the actor who played those
ones? Oh, geez. Blonde guy.
He was in Boxing Helena too, wasn't he? And I can't remember. Julian Sands.
I think that's right.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah,
I can see the movie from here.
I feel like I've seen the first two, and then I maybe petered out.
That's all you need to see. I don't even think he's in the third one. I think it's somebody else. But he casts a flying spell by stealing a child because he needs the fat, which is what you see in the Eggers, right? She renders the fat using a butter churn.
Yeah. Yep.
It's funny because my students are all like, because I give them a Halloween list of movies. And a lot of them are watching The Witch. And they completely missed the fact that that's what's going on and what she's doing.
It's deep in shadow, so if you don't have a pretty good view of it, it's tough to tell what's going on. I think the first time I saw it, I was in a theater where the projection was not as strong or the backlight, whatever, and I couldn't quite tell what was happening in that scene. So I
guess I'm just so aware of that as a concept.
Yeah. And I seem to remember butter churns in Hexen as well. Witchcraft Through the Ages show
That's
up
the
early.
devil using it in Haxan.
Okay. Oh, that's right. He's using the butter churn while he's watching the witches dance.
Yeah, I mean, it's him masturbating. Let's
Yeah, it's fairly clear.
Yeah, it's definitely something else. So the subtitle of the Eggers film, and I'm going to dwell on the Eggers film for a little bit since I have the expert on the Eggers film with me.
Wow, thank you.
Shy of having Eggers here, is a New England folk tale.
Yes.
And I kind of want to delve into that for a little bit, because you think about witch stories. I already alluded to Snow White, but you think of these kind of folk stories. And it's interesting because the subtitle does push it into superstition, even though the ending really makes it clear that for this world, you see the devil at the end of the movie.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point. In the Devil's Advocate book I wrote, I tried to situate it in the realm of folk horror. So from the British tradition, you look at things like The Wicker Man, and one of the main, what you say, markers of folk horror is this idea that the conventional modern religions run up against older ancient folk beliefs and kind of lose in this battle. And I think we see that happening in The Witch. But then I also think there's kind of I argue a tradition of American folk horror as well that I think has its own distinct take on it. And one of the elements is that always has a sense of this is a story being told, and that sense of telling becomes really important. So I think of the Fog in some way seems to me a folk horror tale, and it starts with the grizzled old, is he a sailor, a lighthouse keeper, or whatever?
Yeah, John Houseman.
Watch up and telling the story to all the little kids. And even then, I think of the Blair Witch Project that in a different way foregrounds the fact that it's a story being told by the fact that it's a found footage film. We're having the story being told through the cameras of these people. So we're still really emphasizing the act of telling. And I see that happening in Eggers' film with that subtitle.
No, I mean, it's funny because Maury Leader was on last night talking about Angel Heart in a very similar way.
Yeah.
As the devil actually just controlling the construct of narrative. Which I didn't get around to discussing with him, but I mean, that is an interesting idea just in terms of the use of language in the devil, the idea of contracts in the devil, right?
Yeah.
Which is another thing that's non-textual, right? Where does this originate from, the devil and a contract?
Yeah, that's I didn't trace back how far that goes when I was doing research on The Witch. I mean, I found we've got clear evidence from the trials in Salem that they believed there were books and people would sign it, and that's how we could get all this list of other names. So I know some people have suggested that maybe it comes about in that the devil parodies everything that God does. So just like God has the book of life that the names of the saints are written in, the devil also has his own book.
So it's one of these antichrist things.
Almost, yeah. It's just kind of a mirror image of what God's doing, yeah.
Well, because we talked about the Black Mass too in relationship to this, and it's like textual non-existence. And it was just the sort of most comical idea where it just had to be everything in oppositions for it to be performed correctly. And it's just like, what does that even mean? Shouldn't you be on the moon then or something? So yeah, I mean, I am curious about that. And I am curious about this idea of a New England folk tale, because I mean, part of it too. And I mean, if you look even a little bit later, if you look at things like Goya's representations, which the film draws so heavily on Goya for its imagery. Okay. If you look at his representations of the Inquisition, right, his usage is to mock the church. I mean, but he's particularly mocking Catholicism, and you can draw an interesting juxtaposition between Protestantism, particularly this branch of Protestantism, in America versus Catholicism, I think. But it's interesting to deploy Goya, who is also later than this, in that he's cartooning the church and superstition, right? He finds it corrupt and absurd in a way that would have been blasphemous to these people.
Yeah.
I mean, they probably even would have stuck up for Catholics at this point.
Well, to me, that's in line with what Eggers is doing in the film of The Witch, that we're exploring the what would you say, the extreme nature of the patriarchal worldview, the unreasonable and impossible expectations it puts on everybody, and demonstrating that when you have these expectations, the center cannot hold. You see everybody in the family in various ways trying to navigate how they live out their own lives while still following all of these dictates, and they can't do it, including, I mean, especially William falls under the weight of it too. We see how he tries to hold his family together, but he seems to have a problem with lying to his wife, and then rationalizing it because it's in the best interest of the family.
Well, I mean, it is in a lot of ways a retelling of the Crucible too. I mean, he is in some ways this John Proctor character who, I mean, I think is foretold to be damned.
Yeah.
Say what?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good connection. Yeah.
I mean, it just, to me, I mean, because you also, you had made the comment that Thomason didn't seem to have too much of a sexuality, but if I recall, she actually watches him chopping wood shirtless for an extended period of time.
That's a good point. I always focus more on what Williams' wood chopping said about him in that instance. Connecting it with all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, and
I took it in a completely different Freudian kind of.
Because then she throws it back in his face later that you can do nothing, you can't do anything right but chop wood. Which, as I'm hearing your reading, could really be, her own form of what would you say, kind of denying her own sexual feelings for this by channeling.
Oh, it's like Clytemnestra. It's or something in Racine. You just get overheated by this weird, passionate, forbidden desire. That's how I always took that scene.
Yeah.
Which would be very, again, in terms of these iterations of like what you see in the trials of witches, right? It isn't just sexuality; it's forbidden sexuality.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, incest obviously ranks pretty highly in terms of taboo.
Sure.
No, because it was funny. I was talking to my survey students today about the French Revolution, and Marie Antoinette was accused of witchcraft and incest. Those were the two things that were linked together with her. Charlotte Corday was accused of the same things.
Okay.
But they seem to go together, charges of witchcraft and incest.
Well, it makes sense that those are, I mean, incest is one of the things that you charge your enemies with. When you want to slander somebody, you accuse them of incest. Frequently in the Hebrew Bible, when they want to slander a opposing group, they'll charge them with performing child sacrifices.
So the last thing I wanted to transition into is you talked about exorcism a bit, because of course you were talking about the Conjuring franchise, and any fan of the show knows how I feel about Blumhouse. So Jesus performs an exorcism, which a lot of people aren't aware of, and he actually, I mean, he punishes a group of pigs quite harshly in the process of this exorcism.
Which is kind of, a forerunner to the scene at the end of The Exorcist, where your father Karras jumps out the window. The spirit comes out of the man and goes into the pigs, and they run off the cliff. Yeah,
I mean, it's the most anti-PETA moment, perhaps in the Bible. But it is interesting in terms of that as a type of magic, almost. Right, but sanctioned magic. So I'm going to transition now out of unsanctioned magic
into sanctioned magic.
into maybe the less sexy sanctioned magic. But what's interesting about it being sanctioned magic is that the certain powers we still sort of see the reliance on in terms of the church, because there is still an interest in fetishization around exorcism.
Sure.
And clearly a pop cultural interest around exorcism. They're rebooting the Exorcist franchise. They've already committed to 3 new Exorcist movies.
That's a lot of Exorcist movies.
It is. That aren't needed.
Yep.
I mean, even like, I actually like The Exorcist 3, except for the exorcism part, which was added on to the end.
Yeah, I'm with you that up until then, it's chilling and has some of the. I remember one of the best jump scares in
absolutely
movie history.
Yeah, we have shown that a couple of times actually.
Yep.
George C. Scott breaking down in the police station, one of the finest moments of acting in a horror movie.
Yeah.
Apparently, like, pause the entire scene because people were just like so taken aback and being in proximity to that level of raw emotion.
Yeah.
I feel like that and
his heights in the reboots.
Say what?
I don't think we're going to get to those heights in the reboots.
I don't know. Eileen Bernstein has signed back on. I don't really know what role she has to play.
Yeah.
And Leslie Odom Jr. too. Yeah, take that for what you want. Somebody was telling us the other night, I'm blanking, I think it might have been Joseph Laycock who was telling us that, exorcism has seen a resurgence because of Pope Francis's more liberal policies that he's interested in, also allowing for more exorcisms because conservative Catholics really like exorcism.
Interesting.
Yeah, so know your audience, I suppose. But the exorcism then as sanctioned magic, and the fact that we know it's sanctioned magic in particularly the case of a movie like The Conjuring, because he's given the sanction to perform it or not, right? He has to go through like the weird process of man to obtain a godly power.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and the idea then is that the power comes through the ritual that God, what would you say, that you would want to be careful and not say that the ritual allows God to have the power, but that somehow the power is contained within this ritual as opposed to within the individual people.
Well, so, I mean, you're a professor, I'm a professor. I mean, there's a form for everything, apparently, right? I mean,
exactly. Yep.
I don't know. I mean, we're at a Methodist school here. You're at a seminary. I don't know if we have forms for the exorcism. I might check on Monday.
I don't think that one's posted online.
Yeah, but I mean, maybe somewhere, they dust it off. But that's what it seems to be, right? He waits for Ed Warren waits for the word to be able to have this participatory moment several times in the series, and it's just kind of surreal because I mean it's almost like also it's like when you get your advanced degree or something too, right? It's a form, it's a piece of paper that other people sign off on, who have their mystical robes and powers that bestow this thing on you
that somehow affects a performative change, right?
Yeah. And obviously, The Conjuring takes the turn that it's not necessary.
Yeah. Yep. That the rituals themselves are what have the power, not the hierarchy of the church.
Right. Which seems counterintuitive for what they're trying to do. I mean, wouldn't that be the highest form of blasphemy?
Well, am I right that the screenwriters of The Conjuring identify as evangelicals rather than Catholics?
Yes.
I think so. I think there is an attempt to push forward the evangelical Christian worldview and throw a few mild elbows at the Catholic Church along the way.
I don't remember what the Warrens themselves identified as. Were they Catholic?
I don't know very much about the history of the Warrens, actually.
Okay. Something I was curious about the other night, and I'm kind of curious about the next rung down in terms of witchcraft. Do you see a distinction between American representation of witchcraft and other parts of the world representation of witchcraft? And how would you, per se, define that?
That's an interesting idea. Of the example that I talked about tonight, I referenced, if you count the Conjuring universe as one big happy film, that would be like four groups. I don't know if you can do that, but so 3 of them were American films, and then Voces is Spanish. The Voces certainly dealt more directly with the Inquisition, and that you've got the torture chamber in this family's basement here. So in some ways, then the history becomes really deeply present in a way that I think it wasn't in the American examples, with, of course, the exception of the witch, because I think that's operating on another level entirely from the Conjuring universe and the Unholy.
Sure.
I'm trying to think of, other than that, what I would have to say. I'm not an expert in like the Hammer films of the 60s and 70s, and
Sure.
And there, or I think about, of course, some Mario Bava films and things like that. And I guess I'm not sure what I would say about how they differ from American representations.
I think you lose the sense of paganism.
It's a really interesting question.
Right? We don't have there is no American version of paganism that's thriving, I would say. I could be wrong. I'll probably get flooded with emails for saying that. Who knows? But
that paganism in horror movies is always presented as coming from another country. Like in Midsummer, they had to go to Sweden. Mm-hmm. You don't have that happen in America.
Well, I mean, one of my favorite, Halloween 3, right? Season of the Witch, right? He's a male witch, mm-hmm. But he's Irish, right? It's coming from the old world. He steals Stonehenge. But then you have other movies, like you have the Indonesian movie Satan's Slaves, which completely different idea on cultural, but it is still tied to demons. It's not tied to a Judeo-Christian demon, but it is tied to a demon like the one behind me. Actually, an Indonesian demon behind me. But so I don't know. I see our idea of witchcraft is very much a pastiche in contemporary horror.
Yeah, I think that's really well put.
Depending culturally where you're from and whatever the dominant version of the persecutor seems to define a lot of what that role is and what the possibilities of that role is.
Yeah.
And so I also wonder, because of that, do we actually see more male witches in American culture, just because of culturally how the various persecutions happened? Because as you say, like in the Crucible, you do see the persecution of men. I mean, you get Giles Corey as an obstinate, but John Proctor, screams, "I am the devil."
Yeah, and I'm thinking back to there's certainly a long history in horror of whenever you want to go back to this ancient evil in American horror, you have to go back to old Europe for that, right?
Yeah.
And
there's also a sense of pilgrimage about it too, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we've asked more questions tonight than we could possibly ever answer.
I think that's fun. I enjoy the asking.
Well, I want to thank you again so much for coming on, giving us this great talk.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And I want to invite everybody to tune in tomorrow night for Scott Bruce, and also take the survey that Juan is dropping in the various chats right now. And of course, as always, stay spooky. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
My brain has gone in so many different directions.
Well, that's a good thing. Yeah, my brain is still going in lots of different directions too. So.
It is weird when you do different ones on different nights and you start to...
Oh yeah, and they start to bleed into each other, and you have questions coming from here and meshing up over here, and yeah, I can imagine that.
Not to mention just the differences in the things I've read too, preparing.
Yeah.
Also, just there's so many different interpretations of the devil that I've read about and that we're going to see, that it's been quite fascinating.
That's always a fun question in my corner of the scholarly world with the Hebrew Bible. It's always a really fun conversation to have with students, looking at what the Satan does in the book of Job, where he's part of the divine council and has conversations with God.
Yeah.
He's clearly not the Lucifer devil that we know of from later tradition.
Yeah, definitely. And also he seems to come, I mean, there's Satan in the Muslim tradition too, right? That's closer to what we think of a genie being. Yeah. My brain just everywhere all at once.
Okay. Well,
I hope you were able to enjoy your spooky evening. I think Juan is about to pop on here. I see him adjusting his ring light.